Welcome to Bad Dog Agility, a podcast helping you reach all of your dog agility goals. Whether it's competing under the bright lights of the televised finals at Westminster or successfully navigating a homemade course in your own backyard, we'll bring you training tips, interviews, and news about the great sport of dog agility. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
I'm ready. The show starts with your hosts, Jennifer, Esteban, and Sarah.
I'm Jennifer.
I'm Esteban.
And I'm Sarah, and this is episode 333. Today's podcast is brought to you by hititboard.com and the new Teeter Teach It, an easy-to-use tool that controls the amount of tip on your teeter so you can introduce motion to your dog in a gradual way. Go to hititboard.com for the new Teeter Teach It and other training tools and toys. Use discount code BDA10 to get 10% off your order. That's hititboard.com.
We've got a great topic for this podcast and one that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. It's called Teeter Criteria. And I've been wanting to do it because I'm going to make the case that people don't really have very clear criteria for their teeter performances. What do you think, Jen?
Yeah, the number of people that have quote unquote running teeters, and we'll kind of get into some specifics as we go. But I think the teeter is the least called contact, and therefore people don't train it as hard as they do dog walks and A-frames. You know, dog walks and A-frames, I find at trials have a higher rate of being called. And so, you know, we train what we get called on. And the teeter is just not one that gets called a lot. And therefore, people are very lax about what they want and maintaining consistency. I think it's kind of both. It's knowing what they want and then maintaining what they want.
And when you say getting called, you mean your dog misses the teeter or flies off early, but the judge just misses it or deliberately chooses to non-call it.
I think for a lot of people with the teeter, they can, quote, get away with just kind of running through it because the weight of the dog and even the action of the dog trying to jump off of the teeter will oftentimes slam the teeter down so that it is a technically legal performance, even though they really haven't established a true criteria for their dog.
And I think it's less hindering on the handler's speed and how far ahead the dog can get. You know, a lot of dogs will have some kind of hesitation on the teeter, even if they don't wait for release should the handler have that. So it doesn't tend to affect the next obstacles quite as severely as if your dog doesn't hold criteria on a dog walker, doesn't hold criteria on an A-frame. The teeter, it's shorter. And again, there's that hesitation on the dog's part, why it tips. And so for handlers, you know, they don't get out of position. It doesn't affect it, a refusal or an off course the next obstacle or two. So I think there's a lot of reasons why the teeter, I find to be one which handlers are very lax on setting criteria and maintaining it.
Absolutely. I think if we take a step back, and we look at all the problem areas in typical agility run, for example, start lines, maybe end contact behavior on dog walks. These are not difficult behaviors to teach the dog. These are not difficult things physically for the dog to perform, right? In my opinion, the hardest obstacle to teach and to physically perform for a dog is the weave pulls, right? But I would argue that we have more issues across the board amongst all dogs at all levels in agility with start lines, end contact behavior, than you would say necessarily with getting into the weaves and starting weaving, very complex, difficult behavior. And it has to do with what is legal, right? And so with the contacts, let's say you teach a criteria where the dog has to stop. 2 front feet in the dirt or on the grass, but the back 2 feet are on the plank in the yellow. And that's how you ensure that your dog is hitting the yellow on the way out, right? Hitting that contact. And so you have this stop contact. But there can be times where your dog gets close to that position and it's legal. Your run is still clean. It's still good. You can qualify and have a perfect run, even though your dog has failed to meet the criteria, the standard which you have set.
Right.
Right. And so the start line is the same way, right? You sit your dog, but if your dog starts scooting forward or even stands up or walks right up to the jump, as long as they haven't jumped through the darn electronic eyes and triggered the clock, right? It's a legal run. And so you're going to have people essentially let their dogs kind of get away with that.
Right.
And so I think the teeter definitely falls in that category. And even worse than start lines and the other two contacts, maybe even the weave poles, it is very difficult to judge with the human eye. Like I personally, watching teeters, cannot always tell when a fly off has occurred or not.
Right.
Right. And I think all of these things factor in and contribute to the teeter being a real problem area that kind of everybody sweeps under the carpet. Right. And there comes a point in many of these obstacles, whether your dog is popping the 10th pole of the weave entry or the weave poles, or whether they're botching the entry every now and then, or they're not getting their dog walk or A-frame, or they're breaking start lines. You reach a point where as a handler, you are like, okay, I have to fix this because now this is like 20 runs in a row, or you're like your Q rate has really fallen to something low, right? But the teeter is one of those things where if you just have the right judge, the right sequence coming into the teeter, the right exit, like you're going to get away with it a lot. Right. And so I think that really impacts how people approach it. Okay. So now that we've kind of given the background of why it happens and what's going on there with people, Jen, what are some good alternatives? So let's say I'm a beginner. I'm just starting to teach my dog the teeter. I haven't finished it yet, so we're not even full height yet. And now I'm hearing all these concerning things about the teeter. And I want Jennifer Crank's opinion on different criteria. Well, are there different criteria out there for the teeter? What are the pros and cons of those criteria?
So I think teeters kind of fall into three categories. And it's not to say that there's only three, but there's kind of like three big ones and then subsets within them. And I think of the one you already mentioned, which is a 2-on, 2-off. So coming down the board, front feet on the ground, back feet on the board, waiting for release. And when I say waiting for release, waiting for a release from the handler, whether that's verbal or whether that's a hand cue, it's not up to the dog to release. The dog doesn't get to make the decision when to go. They come into that 2-on, 2-off, handler releases. The other one that has gained popularity, I feel like since, the last 18 to 24 months, maybe even a little further back, is a 4 on the board. So this is basically a dog going to the end of the teeter, waiting for it to hit the ground. But when they're waiting for release, they're waiting with all 4 feet on the board. Now there's like subsets of this. Some people will train a sit. Some people will train it down. Some do a play bow. Some allow a stand, but essentially all 4 feet must stay on the board. And then when the handler decides, they will release. These are the two that we teach at Incredipaws. It's what I teach for my own dogs. But that third category, and I referenced it earlier, is what I often refer to, and I know you guys can't see me, but quote unquote, running teeters.
Right.
And I always kind of laugh on this because running, we think of running contacts as being like a true acceleration or at a bare minimum, maintaining speed across the contact, which is impossible for the dog to do on a teeter and still actually meet criteria. If they accelerated or maintained speed up and across, it would be a fly off. But I kind of categorize a running teeter as one in which the dog makes the decision to exit when the board hits the ground. So there is no verbal release. There is no hand signal release. Basically, the dog goes up over the board. They either slow down or pause or hesitate as the board is tipping. And when the board hits the ground, that is their cue to go. Now, in some cases, this is sort of just what the handler has allowed to happen. They have a slower dog. It's their first dog. I know my first dog. I just posted a video of our run this week, and it was just like up and over, and she went slow enough that when the board hit the ground, she just walked off. So it kind of just happens. But I actually know that there are several trainers and people out there that are teaching the dog that the board hitting the ground is the release. So kind of that running contact or that running teeter I talk about is sometimes intentional and sometimes unintentional. And I think this is the risky one because you're putting it in the control of the dog. You're letting the dog make the decision when to release. I mean, yes, you're saying that the criteria is when the board hits the ground, but can we correctly convey that to the dog? And can we ensure that they don't get anxious and they don't anticipate and they don't leave before the board hits the ground? It also can be limiting in that if you know your dog is going to release when that board hits the ground, you better darn well be in position. You better be exactly where you need to be because you don't have the option to let them wait there another quarter second, half a second, 2 seconds to get into position. So the running teeter is not typically one in which I would advise for the average team. So for my dogs, it's really the 4 on versus the 2 on 2 off. And I will say I've kind of have different dogs doing different things and have hopped back and forth amongst the two. And a little bit of it is sort of dog dependent. I understand the pros and cons to both. But, some of my dogs just want to stay on. They don't like bringing their forward feet off. And then in the opposite case, V was the opposite. She was trained to a 4 on and she just kept going into a 2 on 12. And it was like, you know what, if that's what you want to do, if that's what you're happier with, as long as you're waiting for release. So I actually retrained her to a 2 on 12 on the teeter.
Yeah. Like why fight it at that point?
Exactly.
And I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but, a lot, I would say like an 8-inch dog, I don't think it's even reasonable to do a 2 on 2 off because this is a moving obstacle. So unlike the dog walk, where absolutely an 8-inch dog can do a 2 on 2 off, you are asking them to now have a fair amount of their very small amount of weight off the board, and the back of the board can have some movement, can have some rebound there to it. So I kind of think of like definitely the 8s and probably most of the 12s as being dogs where you are going to do a 4 on. You're not going to ask them to hold on to that board. And then at the 16-inch, that's where you start to kind of have a decision based on, like you said, like what's more natural for the dog. It may be dependent on what you do on other contacts. So for instance, when I was doing a 2 on 2 off dog walk, the dog just automatically was like, there's a board, there's a floor, I'm going to do 2 on 2 off. And it did not make sense to try and convince the dog that this one was different. It actually was helpful to let the dog think that these are 2 very similar behaviors. And like you said, I started 4 on because I was using a tip assist type of training tool to do it. So when the dog was first learning how to do it, the board was in the air. So there was no 2 on 2 off at the beginning part of the process. And I will link in the show notes to, we have a live where we talk about some of these training methods, and you can kind of see a video of what I'm talking about. But then once the board got all the way to the ground, that's when he was like, I know this picture, and would go right into the 2 on 2 off. And he did it like 3 times. And I was like, okay, we're going to go with that.
Those are absolutely the 2 factors that I tell people when they ask me, how do you know, do I do a 4 on or do I do a 2 on 2 off? Oh, that's a mouthful. And it's dog size and what performance you have on the other boards. If you have a 2 on 12 on the dog walk and or A-frame, a lot of times the 2 on 12 just makes sense on the teeter, and then size, all of the little dogs, I'm absolutely going to recommend a 4 on because it's, as you said, moving object and bringing that front feet off just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments, and comment number 1 will be in general. Once you get to say the finals of a big event, AKC Nationals, you look at some of the international competitors, 8-inch dogs in particular here in the United States being the smallest height class, or if you're running 4-inch preferred, these dogs, a lot of them are Papillons, very lightweight. They run all the way up to the end of the board, right? And the board is still kind of slanted upwards when they reach the end. That's how fast they're getting to the end. And they have to be very patient. They have to ride that board all the way down, and they have to, what we call, control the board, right? Because there is going to be some bounce, right? And that bounce can be a little bit precarious for the dog, right? It can throw off a smaller dog, certainly if they're trying to move into a 2 on 2 off position. So if you have an 8-inch dog or a very lightweight dog, even if you're jumping 12 or even 16, if they land and then there's a bounce coming, but they don't anticipate that bounce, maybe you're at a facility you're not usually at or something, right? The surface is different, or for whatever reason, there's a big bounce. I think this used to happen more with all the wooden teeters, like pure wooden teeters. I think most everything now is like a metal frame. It's like heavier, and when it goes down, it stays down. There's a little bit less bounce. Yeah, you need to think in your head, well, do I really want to do this 2 on 2 off, right? And with big dogs, you can definitely get away with more, right? And if in your head you're thinking, okay, well, can I? Well, let me just ask you, Jen. Someone would be listening to us and saying, okay, well, but I've got a dog, and listen, honestly, they're going to do the teeter. It's going to take a good 2, 3, sometimes even 4 seconds because they're so fearful of the teeter. They are walking up the plank, right? And so in that case, would you say there isn't really a 4 on because they're never reaching the end of the board, right? Such that the board is kind of pointing upward and they're riding it down, right? They're kind of just walking over the apex, and then they reach some point where they take enough of a step to put the board down. It's going to be legal because usually it's in the yellow, that paw. But how do they do the release? Like what would you recommend there? Does it make sense to move that dog into a 2-on, 2-off position? I know I'm kind of putting you both on the spot here. So Jen, first, what do you think? If I've got kind of a dog and I'm already playing with like a 3 or 4 second, and I'm not trying to make any international teams here, I'm just trying to get through the teeter. Like, what is a reasonable criteria? Are people going to be like, oh, I don't say 4 on or 2-on, 2-off? Or are people going to think I'm a terrible trainer?
I'm going to pull like a doctor card. I don't have enough information to make a diagnosis. I want further information on this one. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say on that alone, but there are definitely things that I would take into account. So, how old's the dog? Maybe it's fearful because it's young and it's only 12 months old. You can't guarantee that at 5, 6, 7 years old, it's going to be fearful. So if we train nothing and all of a sudden it gets confidence, now we have to retrain.
Right.
Size. If I'm dealing with a 6-year-old Bernese Mountain Dog and the handler is brand new, it's their first dog. So we're talking a large breed, 6 years old, brand new, maybe not, as you said, going out for world teams or going to a national event or not even thinking about getting a mock. Sure, just kind of let it walk up. Board will tip fast because it's a big dog, right? Sure. It's just boom, it's going to come down. By the time the board hits the ground, the dog's strolling, walking, trotting through the yellow. Maybe that works out great. So I definitely have a fair number of students who we've had that conversation. Maybe it is okay to just kind of go up, across, over, and off. From the physics standpoint, a body in motion stays in motion, and a body at rest stays at rest. If you take a dog who doesn't have a ton of momentum and you stop them, now you have the whole get up and go, right? Where if we can just kind of keep that momentum going, both from the dog and the handler. So it's hard to say. I think it's an individual basis, but I certainly don't think it is an unreasonable kind of answer to say that, a dog can just have a in motion, right? That's why I use that term joke running, but an in motion teeter, a nonstop. That's a good way to put it, a nonstop. Teeter. I think you got to look at the factors, but that would be a reasonable teeter performance depending on the team.
Right. So I think it is very dog dependent. So I wanted to put that out there for people who are listening. Okay, now what about the people who are like, I've got this young hotshot border collie, tremendous ground speed. They're jumping, they look good. I'm going to have a running dog walk, Jen. I'm definitely going to run the A-frame. I want to have the fastest teeter possible. So right off the bat, I will tell you in terms of time, if you time it from the time your dog puts their first paw on the teeter and to the time that they are leaving, right, and their last paw is coming off the teeter, the fastest dogs in the world can do it in about 0.95 seconds to about 1.05 seconds. That is super elite world class. There are many American dogs who can do this. And some of them slide into position. Some of them slide into a 2-on, 2-off position. Some of them are kind of slide into a 4-on. Usually with dogs that fast, there is some kind of sliding and weight shift that you can see happening. And typically the plank is like not even parallel to the ground. It's generally pointing upwards by the time the dog starts to move into the yellow zone. That's how quickly they're getting there, right? And generally these are going to be larger dogs. When I say larger, they are typically going to be 20 inches or higher or 35 pounds. I think 35 kind of right around the minimum. I think once you're like under 30, it's really hard to get down like 1 second, under 1 second. The 0.95s that I see are all the larger border collies, right? You're never going to see a Papillon put up a 0.95 teeter, and it's just physics, right? You can run the experiments yourself, put weights. In fact, I think Sarah did that years and years ago, put different weights,
at the end
5
of the board.
pound, 10 pound, 15, 20, and just measured how long it took to drop, right?
And I think now I'm on the spot, so I'm doing this from memory, and hopefully Jen can validate. But I believe that like the standard for the teeter itself is a 3-pound weight falls in 3 seconds. Is that right?
Yes, you are correct. Yes.
Okay, so I don't know what a Papillon weighs. Do you know what a Papillon weighs? I don't know.
Some of them are very. I have seen 4-pound Papillons, right?
Okay, so then you are like literally the standard says it's going to take 3 seconds for that board to fall.
Right. And it was such a big deal because this all came out of a side-by-side comparison that we did between 2 outstanding dogs, dogs of legend, probably more than 10 years ago. It was a very fast Papillon and a Border Collie. And they were running the same course in the AKC National Final. And the dogs were essentially identical, like stride for stride, just not stride for stride, but like yard for yard. They were just really killing this course. And the small dog was absolutely as fast as the big dog. Except for the teeter, right? Because it takes the small dog so much longer. So the large dog was always going to win that, right? And it had nothing to do, in my opinion, with the skill of the dog or the trainer. It was pure physics, right? It was.
I hear this discussion a lot in the 8-inch class when comparing pros and cons to Papillon versus Corgis. So your Corgis still in the 8-inch class, but they can be like 20, 25, 30-pound Corgis. Yeah. And they have such an advantage on the teeter. Right. And so I hear a lot of the smaller 8-inch dogs, the Papillons, the Pomeranians, who will be worried, concerned, threatened. I don't know how you want to say it, about, the Corgi's got such an advantage because their body weight is going to push that teeter down so much faster. So even within the same jump height, less of an issue when you're talking your 20s and your 24s who are a little bit more comparable. But yeah, body weight, body mass on that teeter in those smaller classes for sure becomes a factor.
Okay. Well, I think that's pretty interesting. Very good discussion there. Okay. And I think probably the last point that we have here for this podcast, Jen, with the teeter, are you using, for people who would like to do it, a release word if they're 4 on or 2 on, 2 off, or does the dog get to self-release as soon as they hit that and then you mark it and go? Do you understand my question? Is it more like a winning contact or more like the classic stop contact where, hey, you stop and you stay there. And if I don't say anything for 20 seconds, you stay there for 20 seconds.
Yeah, I understand. And I think this actually brings us into a great, the last point that I really wanted to make was the pros and cons versus the 2 on versus the 4 on, 2 on, 2 off versus 4 on, because for years it was 2 on, 2 off, 2 on, 2 off, and people wanted that sliding teeter. And we've started to see more of a shift to the 4 on. And the first dog I taught the 4 on, I had tons of people. Well, why the 4 on? What's the advantage of 4 on? Why are we switching to this? So I think it's important to understand that the reason that there was a big shift to 4 on, or at least in my mind and from educational purposes, my understanding from most people who are teaching it, is that you get to release quicker. So this gets back to your release part, release quicker without breaking criteria. So what I mean by that is, think you're at a national event. You're at AKC Nationals. It's coming up right around the corner. And the moment that board hits the ground, you are releasing and going. If your criteria is a 2 on, 2 off, then as soon as the board hits, if your dog is not yet in a 2 on, 2 off, which unless they have that sliding teeter, they won't be, you release, you have essentially broken criteria. You have done what I would refer to as an early release, which is different than a quick release. You have done an early release. So it's in events like that our criteria tends to break down and break down and break down. And over time, we kind of muddy the water. But if your criteria is a 4 on, then when the board hits the ground, your dog is 4 on. Therefore, when you release at AKC Nationals in the finals, you have not broken criteria and therefore are able to better maintain your criteria on the long term. So that's been the big reason why I think the shift to the 4 on is because, again, you can maintain criteria easier for the big events. So I think a lot of it depends on how many big events are you going to? Are you only doing one a year, AKC National, or are you filling it with cups and classics and regionals and nationals of 3 different organizations? The flip side of that, in my experience, is what I have found is the end position for the 4 on is then harder to maintain. 2 on, 2 off is black and white, front feet on the ground, back feet on the board, period, end of discussion. 4 on, and this is coming from a small dog person. I have Shelties. I run small dogs more than the large dogs. So I think the Border Collie people and Border Collie instructors have a different perspective. Is that what do you define as 4 on? I think we can say on the surface, it's, my dog driving all the way to the end. Well, define the end. Okay. If the end starts out as, okay, the dog has to be 4 inches from the end. What happens when they stop 6 inches and then 10 inches and then 12 inches? And this was essentially a factor in why after doing a dog as a 4 on, I switched back to the 2 on, 2 off, is she started stopping on the board earlier and earlier and earlier. And she wasn't driving to the end because she's like, look, I'm 4 on, I'm waiting here. And so when I was trying to build that independence, especially her driving ahead of me across the teeter, when B drives ahead of me, she knows she has to drive ahead until she hits the ground because that's where the front feet need to be. But with the 4 on, I was struggling to get them to go as far. And I know I'm a smart enough trainer. I know there's things I could have done to work around that and tools and whatnot. I'm not trying to blame the method, but it's pros and cons. So 4 on, you get to maintain criteria with quick releases, but it's harder to define what is the end. And 2 on, 2 off, it's easier to define the end. But when you get to big events, you're releasing quickly. Both of those, and I have, again, dogs doing both things, always, always, always should wait for my release, which was your question. I do not have any dogs who are trained to release on environmental cues. So they should not release on the teeter banging. They should not release on the board hitting ground. They should not release on a judge's noise of hollering 5 and fast. It is the cue of the next obstacle. So tunnel, jump, weave. Even if I look back at my dog and say, good dog, they should hold position, whatever position that is. So I do not have any running contacts that are trained that way and taught that way. Arguably, if you watch any of my runs at AKC Nationals here in a few weeks, don't hold me to that because it's a big event and we'll be pushing and it might happen. But hopefully we're only letting that happen every once in a while.
All right. Well, great discussion. So I think we've kind of covered everything. Now, this podcast was not about training the teeter and how to teach it. It was just a discussion about criteria, and I think a much needed one. So thank you to Jen and Sarah for your perspectives. And that's it for this week's podcast.
We'd like to thank our sponsor, hitupboard.com. Happy training.
Thank you for listening to Bad Dog Agility. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information, updates, and links to all our socials, just check out our website, www.baddogagility.com. If you haven't already signed up for our email subscription, we would love to have you join the BDA community. Until next time, take care.
Why don't skeletons fight each other? They don't have the guts.